Good evening. I've been asked to give you two talks on the subject, where was God in the tsunami? It's a question being widely asked in the press and in many minds. You know, 5 days after the 9/11 disaster, when the Twin Towers of New York collapsed, I was invited to give a talk on that, and I feel much the same tonight. But what a difference between the two events. The tsunami killed, what, 50 times as many people as 9/11? What I call 2612 was far worse, damaged far more property right around the world and affected many nations too. But the biggest difference between the two disasters, the two tragedies, was that this one was not caused by human beings. 9/11 was directly caused by us, or by them. And so this is what some people, the insurance people, call an act of God. I'm not sure that that means a lot these days, except that it's something they can't insure against, because it had no human content. To me, it's almost as meaningless as swearing on a Bible in a court of law that you will tell the truth. These are all vestiges of our godly past. Well, now here we have this disaster which we've all witnessed on television. We've seen it happen. The horror of it has come home to us. Let's just consider for a moment the human needs that are waiting after such a disaster. The first needs after a disaster are physical. The need for medical aid to the wounded, for burial of the dead, for food, water, shelter. And there is an outpouring of aid from the whole wide world into the Indian Ocean area where the disaster took place. But those physical needs very quickly give way to emotional needs. There is the shock, the trauma, and counselors are needed for those who are suffering from literally a shock wave. After that shock has subsided a bit, the next emotion to be dealt with is grief. And I feel very deeply for those who have lost loved ones, especially for those who have no news, who are waiting for news. I'm reminded of the days in World War II where somebody would bring a telegram which said, "Missing in action." And the people would never know. This happened to my cousin. She escaped from Malaya when the Japanese came in with her two sons, but she never knew what happened to her husband for years. She didn't know if she was a widow. And for years she had to live with this ignorance, which was even harder to bear than if she had been told, as she later learned, that her husband was killed by the Japanese. So then, after shock, comes sorrow and grief, and then comes anger. After every disaster, there is an anger that needs to be directed, someone to blame, a scapegoat. And people look around for someone to vent their anger on. And that anger needs to be dealt with. In this case, of course, the scapegoat is God himself. And I've already heard many people blaming God for what happened. They can't blame anyone. They can blame Tony Blair for not breaking his holiday and coming back to take charge of the situation. But they know full well that there is no human being to blame in this case. God becomes the scapegoat. The tragedy is that after every disaster, people are either drawn nearer to God, or they are driven further from God. One or the other is bound to happen to all of us, even if we were not personally involved. And so I move to the third need. There are the physical needs, food, water, medicine, shelter. There are the emotional needs, shock, grief, anger. But then come what I want to call the intellectual needs. There is a need in every human being to make sense of what has happened, to ask deeper questions, and we are moving now already from the first and second needs into the third, as people ask these big questions. And there are two major questions which everybody wants to ask. First, how? How did this happen? How did it come to happen? What caused it, naturally speaking? And of course, science is the answer to this. And we now know what happened. We know that two tectonic plates rubbed up against each other, got caught, and the movement stopped for a bit and then suddenly was released. And the energy released was so enormous it sent a gigantic wave around the whole Indian Ocean. Do you know that it even wobbled planet Earth 2 inches on its axis? So the whole Earth moved. It was a gigantic thing, but we know how it happened. And of course, the reason for asking the question, how did it happen, is so that we can avoid it or escape it, or at the very least, have warning. The sad thing is that the Pacific Ocean has such a warning about tsunamis, but the Indian Ocean, being in a poorer part of the world and not next door to America, didn't have it. But that's the first question that the intellect needs to ask and answer, if possible, to escape or avoid it the next time. But there is an even more important question that people's minds grapple with and need to be satisfied about, and that is why. Not just how, but why did it happen? We need to find a reason for it, because the one thing we can't cope with is senseless suffering. Wasted suffering, wasted life, wasted property. And so we want to know why it happened. Is there any reason behind it? Is there any sense in it? Or do we have to live with something that has no reason at all and therefore leaves us suspended in our mental questions? Well, now, it may seem heartless to be discussing these objective questions now, but nevertheless, I believe it's necessary, if not only for the reason that God is being blamed. I want to defend God. I believe in him, I trust him, and I believe a lot of blame is unnecessarily and even wrongly attached to God in this kind of situation. Now, I'm going to be dealing in this first talk tonight with some of the wrong answers that are being given to this question, why, even by Christians and church leaders. So tonight is going to be a little negative, I'm afraid, but I want to clear the decks for the true answer, what I believe is the Bible answer to this appalling question, this deep question, where was God in all this?